Anybody using those seats there? There are a couple seats. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's six.
Leslie, are you starting yet?
Yeah.
A few minutes, because I think Alice Pepper will be here.
But all I'm doing is saying, oh, thank you, I'm coming. And I'm Leslie Shoemaker, the president of the society. I know a lot of you. And we're a very small, totally volunteer-run organization. We have two main focuses. Obviously, history is one, and the other is 19th century art. Because of that, our focus is well beyond Jackson and the Valley. I think of our art sales, probably the big majority of paintings go beyond the Valley and all over the country, really. So if you want to support us, you don't have to be a Jackson resident. We have members from all over, and we don't have membership categories. We consider anybody that makes a donation a member. And there, as you go out the door on the right, there's some sheets. If you want to pick one up and send it in, that'd be great. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce Steve Reeder, who is our program director, who will introduce our speaker. And if any of you have any ideas for programs or want to give a program, let either Stephen or I know. And thanks for coming.
All right, well, people are still arriving in here. 2 minutes, because it's not quite. I'm holding Stephen off for a minute. All right, I'll get them. They're all. Oh, yep, I'll do it.
I was just thinking, hindsight's 2020. Yeah, the third grade. Doesn't feel as crowded as we have this one. It's all right. It's actually up front. It's like a going on. I noticed.
She just had her ass in my face. No green tea.
Move that around if you want.
Nice job, man.
I thought I was going to gain the frame. I did the, but not all of them.
Well, you attracted a big crowd. Well, that's true. We had fun. I totally agree.
Did Alice come yet?
She's down front.
Oh, okay, good,
They saved a seat for her.
good.
She's gonna put her hearing aids in.
Thank you. Where's your other half? Where's your other half?
He's parking the car.
Oh, okay,
Oh,
okay.
God, I was hoping you left him home.
But he's gonna come to us. He knows better.
Yeah, I know.
Hello. Welcome. Nice to see such a large crowd. I'm Stephen Weeder. I'm a board member here at the Jackson Historical Society, and with the help of Ann Pillion, Leslie Shoemaker, and Dawson, they allow me to carry the title Program Coordinator.
Very well.
Thank you. I want to mention our program coming up in February. Jeffrey Denman is an author, and he will be doing a program on February 25th about his current book, John Quincy Adams, Reluctant Abolitionist. So that's coming up on February 25th. There'll be advertising in e-news and in the newspaper, I'm sure, for that program. Tonight, we'd like to welcome Chris Doctor for this program, current program. Chris is a husband. Many of you know him as the husband of Gail Doctor, He's a father, soon to be grandfather, and architect. He graduated with a master's of architecture from Miami University in Ohio, and he moved to Boston in 1984 to start his career. In 1988, he became a licensed architect. He and his wife moved to Ipswich in 1992. He joined Olson Lewis Plus Architects the following year, 1993, and became a partner in 2003. His architectural design experience ranges from renovations and additions to new construction projects for civic restorations, historic town building reuse, public libraries for public agencies and private clients. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Leslie. Steve's calling. So thanks for having me. This is my first foray in doing this sort of thing. So, as I think my wife said this morning, I'm doing this by the seat of my pants, hardly. A lot of research has been done. So I'm really excited about this. I started with this photograph that I found. And being relatively new to Jackson in 2016, all I knew about Jackson was what you see. And when I found this photograph, I was amazed at how much of a village there was. And this is a photograph from 1890. So let's go ahead and get started. And I want to thank Warren for this. This was a cover art that he had commissioned for the Jackson Historical Society's History of Jackson. So I thought I'd use it. So what does it mean? Architecture and the American spirit in Jackson, New Hampshire. So I'm going to be looking at a couple buildings in the downtown around the forming of the country and how that influenced what we did here in Jackson, and how the buildings in Jackson were influenced by what was going on culturally beyond Jackson. I think Leslie said that the Historic Society is beyond Jackson. This was quite a bit beyond Jackson. So in exploring this topic for this afternoon, I came across several books. The most interesting was a catalog of books, in addition to, of course, this the history of Jackson. Thank you, Alice. It was a catalog of books, 15 volumes, and the name of it was The Pageant of America, A Pictorial History of the United States, published by Yale University Press from 1925 to 1929. It turns out, as part of the United States sesquicentennial, a number of special projects were organized to document the country's people, history, and culture. This was one such project. And of course, to my great delight, I came across volume 13, titled The American Spirit in Architecture, written by Talbot Faulkner Hamlin in 1926. This volume gives an interesting perspective on how American culture evolved. Hamlin suggests that historically, the culture in the North and the South, now remember, America was just on the East Coast at that time, early in its founding. The North and the South evolved in different ways. He suggests that in New England, and I quote, intensely serious men and women were seeking a place where they could own land and worship in their own way. Canny, full of practical common sense, narrow and often intolerant, and yet full of a contradictory enthusiasm for the great English tradition of political liberty. They gave to the country, they founded a character of independence and deep seriousness that is unmistakable. Mostly of humble birth themselves, there was at first among them no aristocracy save that of learning. The minister was the great man. They had no great plantations. New England farmers huddled together in compact villages, and from these centers hewed an ever-widening circle out of the forest. That could certainly characterize Jackson, couldn't it? So tonight, that's the book, volume 13. And so for this afternoon, I'd like to start where Peter Benson left off, and not from his lectures on maps, however, but from the introduction in Alice Pepper's book, A History of Jackson, New Hampshire, part 1. In it, Peter wrote a chapter titled Jackson Before Settlers Arrived. At the end of this chapter, Peter takes a passage from Samuel Adams Drake's book, The Heart of the White Mountains, Their Legend and Scenery, written in 1882. And he quotes, here Drake eloquently articulates the intimate relationship between Jackson and its people. Quote, Jackson is the ideal mountain village. From Thornhill, it looked a little Elysium, with its handful of white houses huddled around its one little church spire, like a congregation sitting at the feet of its pastor. You perceive neither entrance nor exit, so completely is the deep vale shut in by mountains. The streams that make two veins of silver in the green floor seem vainly seeking a way out. One would think nature had locked the door and thrown away the key. Now, for Jackson, by the 1790s, more families were arriving. By 1796, the settlers felt the need of town government to collect taxes, build and maintain roads, and establish schools. In June of that year, Jonathan and Clement Meserve petitioned the state legislature to incorporate the town. They stated that they were in the most northerly part of New Hampshire, the most mountainous part of the state, and perhaps the most mountainous part of North America. And a lot of this is coming from Alice Pepper's book, you see there. By 1800, there was still no town center, no village. There was no school or church. There were 25 families living on farms scattered along the Wildcat or the Ellis Rivers or on nearby hills as much as 3 or 4 miles from the junction of the two rivers. The latest arrivals might still be living in rough log shelters set in barely cleared fields. Earlier settlers would be in more substantial dwellings. The first church building, the Free Will Baptist, organized in 1803, was erected at the corner of Wilson and Black Mountain Roads. Beginning around 1800, the first businesses in town were mills. Grist mills to grind corn into meal, and sawmills to produce lumber. The road layout in 1801 mentions 2 mills on the Wildcat River, Pinkham's Mill at the foot of Jackson Falls, and Meserve's and Chelsea's Mill between the falls and Gill Bridge. The first mention of a store in the town records is in 1824. Daniel Pinkham also had the first hotel in town, where men sat around the kitchen fireplace and drank cider. By the mid-1800s, a town center was developing along the bank of the Wildcat River near the original Pinkham farm. There were 1 or 2 stores, a blacksmith shop, and the village school. Then, on February 28th, 1846, a group of townspeople who thought that the church should be in the village also met to discuss the way this was to be accomplished. They voted to erect a house of worship the following summer. A committee was chosen to oversee the design and construction. And so you'll see that the image on the left is actually from Freiburg, although it looks like ours, and you'll see why in a moment. And this was actually, what I'm going to read now is from the committee notes from that meeting, from a meeting on March 21st in 1846. The committee presented a plan for the proposed house and recommended the Methodist Chapel at Freiburg for a model. Chose George P. Meserve and Cyrus F. Pinkham to visit and examine the Freiburg house. Adjourned to the 18th of April, 1846. Rufus U. Pinkham, clerk. So here we have, that's the notes there on the right and the church on the left. So the Freiburg Methodist Church, Episcopal Church, in 1845. And so we had the good fortune of connecting with the Freiburg Historical Society and learned a bit more about the church in Freiburg. And because we were curious about it, all we knew about it was from the history of the church, and it sort of referenced it vaguely, and there was not much left in Freiburg that we could see. In fact, this image in the lower right-hand corner is from 1989, and that doesn't even look like that anymore. A lot of the panels are missing, and it's been sided with vinyl. And so what we learned is that in 1845, a new Methodist church was constructed at 100 Main Street, which is now 519 Main Street. By the way, some of this we got from the book that the Freiburg Historical Society published in October of last year. And so this church, by 1895, only 50 years later, the Methodists relocated to Freiburg Harbor at the end of McNeil Road at the Old Course Saco River at that time. At that time, Arlo Genis purchased the building and sold it to the Church of the New Jerusalem, also referred to as the New Church and associated with Swedenborganism, where it became the parish house, or the New Church Hall. So it went from being a Methodist church to being a church hall for another church around the corner. And then in 1956, the church was sold, and the building was sold to the Paugus Grange, which you can see there now. And then the other thing we learned is that in the 1960s, the building was lifted to accommodate a new basement, and a bulkhead was added on the street side to access it. And we learned that Linda Drew, who was so kind to let us in to the Historical Society, her husband had built it in the 60s. So you can actually see the difference here, right? So you can see the doors pretty low here in this one, and then here there's a whole basement that's been added. And quite a few more steps here, and then a bulkhead to access it. Steeple is long gone. Presumably, I think it said in 1890 it was no longer there. And then this is an old Sanborn map, an old fire insurance map that I found that also identified it in 1886 as the Methodist Church. There was, at one point there was some question about whether or not there was a steeple on it, because there hadn't been one for quite some time. But even here, it identifies the belfry in the church, and obviously from the photograph. And now, of course, since 2005, Tina Titzer now has her dance studio in this building. So it's interesting, because if you go down to Main Street in Freiburg, you might not even notice it. It pretty much blends in with the rest of the buildings on that main street there. Now, before we get into the architecture of these churches, let's step back and take a look at what was unfolding in this young nation. In the first half of the 19th century, a new nation was emerging. America was evolving into its own independent nation with a desire to create its own sense of identity. 5 important events that happened. In 1800, the U.S. Capitol moved from Philadelphia and was established in Washington, D.C. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. In 1814, the Star-Spangled Banner was a new national anthem that captured the patriotic spirit of the time. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine, establishing the U.S. as an independent global nation. And in 1828, the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad that establishes the start of a national transportation infrastructure. So you can see that the country is really coming together as a single nation. And at this time, it's a time of nation building, increasing the size of its territories with a westward expansion. In 1845, the U.S. annexes Texas. This expansion was codified with the Manifest Destiny, establishing our destiny to expand across the continent. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States has in place many of the building blocks needed to become a powerful nation on its own. The United States at this time went from external challenges with Mexico and the United Kingdom to internal challenges in the divide growing over attitudes of slavery that result in a civil war between Confederates and Union supporters by the second half of the 19th century. So with all of these changes going on in this expansion, this new nation needed a new American architecture. So along comes Benjamin Latrobe. Who is Benjamin Latrobe? So Benjamin Latrobe was a British-born architect and civil engineer who established architecture as a profession in the United States. By the early 19th century, he was considered the first American architect. He was the most original proponent of the Greek Revival style in American building, using Greek forms in America as early as the end of the 18th century. And these are some of his projects. You can see a lot of the influence for Washington, D.C., the new nation's capital. So this use of the Greek revival was no more evident than for the design of the capital of the United States, as it moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. Many of the buildings in Washington, D.C. were modeled after classical Greek structures, buildings like the Capitol building itself, the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, and Union Station. This new city represented a new democratic ideal reflected in its architecture. You'll see on the left the Acropolis, right? The foundation of democracy. And so we were emulating that in our new capital. In the book, The American Spirit in Architecture, Hamlin suggests, quote, "The Greek temple symbolized the aspiration of thoughtful American Democrats who dreamed of lifting their country to something of the glory that was Greece. The Greek temple became a courthouse, a church, and even a dwelling. This place expressed his dignity as a citizen participating in the government of a great people." In the middle two-thirds of the 19th century in America, the Greek revival was the most popular style. To make up for a paucity of inspiration at home, the building forms of other times and other civilizations were called upon. Great architecture is the work of a people whose life rests on a stable economic foundation, whose traditions run far into the past, and who have become conscious of the peculiarities of their culture. End quote. So at the same time, because there was a scarcity of architects, only being one at the time, builders and developers throughout the country looked to pattern books. And there was a popular appetite for the Greek that was sustained by these architectural pattern books. And you'll see in most of these, that was the style of preference for the pattern books. The most important of which was Asher Benjamin's The Practical House Carpenter, 1830, which you see there on the left. That's actually an 1843 version of it. But that was published many times since then. And this guide helped create the proliferation of Greek-inspired designs. These included entryways, the use of columns, pilasters, entablatures, and attic stories. Now, what is all that? So in these pattern books, basically what they were giving were these patterns and compositions and dimensions and proportions of the Greek style. And so for instance here you'll see, and the most popular, so there are basically 5 column types, the classical column types, right? So there's Tuscan, Doric, Corinthian, Ionic. Anyway, so, but the most important one for the Greek revival was this one, was the Doric. And so the Doric column has a certain proportion. It has an entablature. So this whole piece, from the top of the column up to here, is the entablature. And oftentimes you'll see a lot of decoration in the original Greek forms, but you'll also see later that it gets simplified. So there are not only the columns, but there are pilasters. A pilaster is half a column that's on a wall, that's indicating where a column might be. And then oftentimes in the Greek revival style, you'll see a low-pitched gable roof facing the front that sits on the entablature. Another variation was for, in here you can see the columns come up, in this case the pilasters with an entablature, and above that is what's called the attic story, which oftentimes will hide something behind. So now that takes us back to Freiburg. Oops. So that takes us back to Freiburg and the Greek Revival Model Church for Jackson. As recounted in the book Oxford County, Maine, A Guide to Its Historic Architecture, 1984, it refers to the Freiburg Methodist Church, built in 1845, as follows, quote, The design was a local variation of the more typical temple form Greek Revival style. The symmetrically arranged facade has a raised center section. So see here, it has a raised center section. And with inset panels on the top, flanked by bays, framed by tall paneled pilasters, which in turn support heavy entablatures. It also displayed a tall two-stage open belfry until the 1890s. So here are the entablatures, right? The pilasters that come up, they're paneled, the middle piece comes up, and on top, interestingly, so this is the Jackson Church. You can see the proportions are a little bit different, although the general composition is the same. You'll see that the panels up here, there are 3 shallow panels, and over here there are 2 taller panels. The same thing is true for these panels, are a little bit taller in Jackson. And in Freiburg, there's a 2-level steeple, whereas in Jackson, only a 1-level steeple. So a little simpler design. But you use it, certainly, I mean, it's pretty clear that they use the Methodist Church of Freiburg as the model. Thanks. So, what are some of the Greek revival elements? So, what I did here is I drew in where the gable is behind. Right, so you can see that, you can imagine that if this entablature continued all the way across with this gable, that would be a pretty typical Greek revival composition. And so with these, what they did is they took that center panel, raised it up to hide with these attic stories, right? Remember that? The attic stories hide the gable and really give this centerpiece some presence and verticality for the steeple. And so some of the elements of the Greek revival is the symmetry, the attic stories, and unadorned frieze, so that panel there is blank. Double hung windows, the pilasters, an entablature, a gabled roof beyond. Here, these are open columns, and another entablature above. So here are some images of the Jackson Church, and this was probably around 1847. You can see that there are no other buildings here yet. Also, you can see the road here is really more of a cow path than a road at this point. Also, you can see how much green is in front of this church and the barn that's still there. What's interesting to look at then is to compare that to much later. This happens to be 1920, but it could be earlier. But essentially, you'll see that the green starts to disappear in the front, and the road becomes more formalized, and there's some construction adjacent to it. So it's starting to evolve. However, the church itself hasn't changed at all. In fact, even the configuration of the way they have the shutters hasn't changed. The other thing that we observed too that was interesting is that for all of these, and this was true in Freiburg as well, that they have shutters on these upper panels that are just blank panels. And I think that had to do with the proportions and the composition of the overall Greek revival design of the church, not so much for the windows. So let's step back again into history. So what was going on? Well, by this time, in 1861, the Civil War had started. It had divided a nation that had just recently begun to define itself. As an emerging nation, not only are we divided, but now not as a singular in vision for our culture as well as an architecture to capture it. So as we were beginning to develop this sort of single vision for the architecture and who we are as a nation, we're now divided. So what happens to architecture as part of that division? So now back to Jackson. So I like this photograph because you can sort of imagine, sans this piece perhaps, what the village looked like when it was only the church. So in 1863, and this is from Alice's history as well. So this is Jackson's part in the Civil War, right? In 1863, a mob at Jackson, New Hampshire, on Thursday night last, burned the hotel where the deputy provost marshal was engaged in serving notices to drafted men. The deputy barely escaped with his life. The house burned was the Forest Vale Inn, well known to White Mountain travelers as the halfway house between Crawford and Glen houses at Jackson Falls. And presumably that Forest Vale Inn was where the Wentworth is now. Or, as we are about to see, the Thorn Mountain House. So you can see, so if you go back to that other slide, right, you see the outlook there on the left, and that's its relationship to the Thorn Mountain House there. So after the Civil War, in 1869, Joshua Trickey decided that his expanded farmhouse in Jackson wasn't adequate to handle the increasing demand, and on the site of the burned Forest Vale House, he opened the Thorn Mountain House, which you see here. An inn he had built for his daughter Georgia and her new husband, Marshall C. Wentworth, as a wedding present. So if anyone's getting married, you can think about wedding presents. And you can see that at this point, it's basically, the style is really just an expanded farmhouse, and the Thorn Mountain House sign is there. So this was the farmhouse style, taking familiar forms and expanding it to accommodate its new purpose. So at this time, there is the stick style. And again, after the Civil War, the uniquely American stick style developed as a form of construction that uses wooden rod trusswork, the origin of its name. The buildings are topped by high roofs with steep slopes and prominent decoration of the gables. The exterior is not bare of decoration, even though the main objective remains comfort. It takes its cues from the English half-timber design and replaces the plaster with wood shingles or boards. So you could imagine an old English half-timber with, instead of plaster, they're using either shingles or boards in the panels. Richard Morris Hunt, one of the most prominent architects at that time doing this style, constructed the John N. Griswold's house in Newport, Rhode Island in 1862 in this style, and that's this house on the left. Gradually evolving into the Queen Anne style, the stick style was progressively abandoned after 1873. So we're getting to the styles. We're just sort of going through the evolution of the styles to get to the next one that we're going to talk about in Jackson. So gradually evolving into the Queen Anne style, but before we get to the Queen Anne style, there was another style that was equally popular, and that was the Colonial Revival. At the same time, in the early 1870s, the Colonial Revival movement was quite strong as well. There was a great sentiment that the country was getting too big and divided. It was important to find a time when America was smaller. The craze for colonial architecture that developed at this time in the popular magazines would send people to places where they could feel the fiber of the old America, perhaps largely mythical, which seemed to them to speak of a hope for the future. And that's from Vincent Scully, a Yale professor on architecture. So we have these two styles. We have the stick style and we have the colonial revival. And then, in 1876, the United States celebrated its centennial with an exposition in Philadelphia. Of all the exhibits at the Centennial Exhibition, the most popular ones were those that evoked a time past. Even though there was plenty of stuff at the exposition about the future and mechanization and factories, the most popular were the things that evoked a time past. That of the colonial era. Here was an event where evocations of the past, supposedly more virtuous and desirable than the present, suddenly became dominant themes. And you can see here on the left, the British government buildings were built in a half-timbered, Old English cottage style, which at that was called Queen Anne. In the US, shingles and boards replaced the plaster, and the Centennial brought the Queen Anne fashion clearly into the limelight. So you can see here now how the stick style with the colonial is now evolving into the Queen Anne style. So the Queen Anne shingles and panel work, also further reinforced by the architectural influence of the wooden buildings of Japan at the exposition, which is in the upper right-hand corner there. These buildings were frame construction with their overhanging eaves. And so the eaves are these, where the bottom of the roof comes across, and you can see the overhanging eaves is quite prominent in all of these. The structural articulation recalls that of the American stick style. So what we're seeing here in these half timbers or in these sticks is it's really an expression of the structure inside the building. So we can see that the Queen Anne style was imported from English architects who were inspired by the half-timbered walls and patterned masonry of medieval and Jacobean style buildings. The most influential of these architects was Richard Norman Shaw, who arrived in New York in the late 19th century. Shaw's elegant townhouses rely primarily on his individual adaptation of 18th century styles that was called Queen Anne. His picturesque country houses derived from a study of regional developments in the English manor style of the 16th century and are carried out with a marked respect for the differing nature of local building materials. Although the Queen Anne style was picturesque, it retained the rigidity of the Greek revival and stick style and the discipline of both. It remained somewhat formal and disciplined. So here are some other examples of the Queen Anne. And one of the first ones was the one on the left in America in 1875, the Watt Sherman House by H.H. Richardson. So many of the distinctive features that you find in the American Queen Anne style is the asymmetrical facade. So if you remember in the Greek Revival, everything was very symmetrical, very orderly, and very disciplined. So now we're moving away from that as the country is becoming divided. We see that our architecture is in a way reflecting that. So we have asymmetrical facades. We have a dominant front-facing gable. So you'll see that here and here and here. Over the overhanging eaves that I talked about earlier. Round or square towers. So you see a lot of towers. A porch covering the front facade. And then, in many cases, a second-story porch or balconies. Pedimented porches, so basically having a little pediment at the porch, here and here. Differing wall textures, such as patterned wood shingles, so you'll oftentimes see different patterns in the different panels, or different shingle types, so it's quite eclectic. You'll see classical columns, spindle work, oriel or bay windows, so think you see that up here, little bay windows, monumental chimneys, and then painted balustrades. So these would be painted. So you see, it's a very romantic but very disciplined architecture. And now back to the Thorn Mountain House. By 1880, Marshall and Georgia Wentworth decided to expand the capacity of the Thorn Mountain House. They then hired architect William A. Bates from New York to design separate cottages around the main building. So who is William A. Bates? I knew you were going to ask. Bates practiced from 1880 until about 1920. In the 1890s, Bates was most well known for being brought to Bronxville in New York by William Lawrence to help with the creation of Lawrence's model suburb called Lawrence Park. Now, there were many of these on the East Coast that were beginning to develop, sort of these high-end suburbs with this style of house. And that's where Bates was the most prolific, was in that suburb. However, his work also included places like Detroit, New York, Wyoming, Maine, Long Island, Tuxedo Park, Cleveland and Canton, Ohio, and Ridgefield, Connecticut. And here you can see most of the work at this time was in that Queen Anne style. So you'll see the asymmetrical facades, the front gable, the porches, and the oriel windows. You'll see here, too, that he's got these very steep gables. And then this I found interesting because it looks very much like Thornycroft, which we're about to see. And this was actually a house he did in New Jersey. So his first design, which was published in Architect and Building News in 1885, was this. And so what's interesting about this is this was a proposal, because clearly this was not built, right? So in here you can see he was proposing Wentworth Hall, as well as Thornycroft, Alden, and Glenthorne, these cottages. And then you can see that they're all connected with this porch, with the gable, remember the gable porch, and then the second floor balcony or porch as well, in that Queen Anne style. So this is a quote from Architect and Building News from 1885 that describes this design. The group of buildings herewith illustrated is known under the collective name of the Thorn Mountain House. Although each has its own individual and picturesque designation, when originally opened to the public, it was a rambling old farmhouse situated upon the eastern slope of the mountain, with Mount Washington some 13 miles away to the north, Giant's Stair on the west, and Moat and Iron Mountains to the south, with North Conway but 5 miles away. The locality abounding in the most varied and delightful views of pastoral scenery. Its accommodation was soon found inadequate to constantly increasing demands, and General Wentworth, the owner, determined upon the enlargements here shown by the erection of Alden Cottage, followed by Wentworth Hall, Thornycroft, and the Glenthorne in the order named. In the grouping, the buildings of special attention has been given to a nice adjustment of form and color to the surrounding landscape. And by linking the separate buildings together by covered verandas, a practical purpose is served and an effect of unity is obtained, admirably in accord with the picturesque surroundings. But little change has been made in the original grades. Approaching the building by wide drives, one enters a spacious hall finished in oak with heavy wainscot and paneled ceiling. This room has a fine, large fireplace. Opening from the hall are the parlors finished in white and gold of delicate modeling. On the other side of the hall are the billiard, reading, and dancing rooms. The dining hall will seat 350 guests and with kitchens, etc. Occupies a building by itself to the west of the hall. So that's Wentworth Hall. It is finished in mahogany with a high wainscot and open timber ceiling, richly molded, the west end of the room being occupied by a huge brick fireplace of the olden time with andirons and swinging crane. And you can see the chimney there for that. The decoration throughout has been carefully studied with an endeavor to obtain subdued yet rich results. As in most hotels, the aggregation of so many people advanced into special prominence the matter of sanitation and the successful completion of a thorough system of drainage and a pure water supply was much facilitated by the natural advantages of an admirably located site. I found that fascinating that we talk about sanitation in an Architecture Engineering News magazine. And so one of the other things I found interesting about this, so this was built at one point, and this was emulating it in some way, continuing these multiple gables at the top, steep gables, right in that Queen Anne style. And I suspect this was in a way a nod to the mountains beyond. And you can see that even on the Glenthorne, that's the double gable there. So here we have, so this is 1881, Alden Cottage was completed. It was built in the popular Victorian style known as Queen Anne, with the asymmetrical facade, decorative shingle siding, turrets, bay windows, and broad porch. So here you can see there are certainly different, and we'll see, well, actually there's a better photograph in a second. But you can see its relationship. So there's still, the old farmhouse is still here. That really hasn't changed at all. In fact, it looks like it may not have been connected with porches yet in this particular photograph. And here's a better photograph of Alden. And this happens to be from 1890, but you can see how the different scalloped shingles, the plain shingles, all the different materials, the very steep gabled roofs, the overhanging eaves, the bay windows, and the broad porches, all from the Queen Anne style. And then in 1883, a new larger building named Wentworth Hall was constructed to the west of the Thorn Mountain House. This contained a dining room capable of seating 350 people, sleeping rooms above. And so what's interesting about this photograph too is that, so this is Wentworth Hall, and this is still the Thorn Mountain House, but you can see from the last photograph, now we've added these porches, right? The porches connect, but we've also added a porte cochere, and then the porch or the balcony on the second floors here that start to connect with the Queen Anne style of both the Wentworth Hall and Alden. And so in 1885, two more cottages were built, Thornycroft and Glenthorne. And Thornycroft is in here, is between Alden and the Thorn Mountain House. And they were connected with this porch that connects them all. And you can start to see that even the porch on the Thorn Mountain House was getting a little bit broader. When two more cottages and the casino were built the following year, in 1880, so let's just take a quick look. So this is Thornycroft, and you can see that very much similar to that house that we saw that he designed in New Jersey. Okay. So when two more cottages and the casino were built the following year, 1886, they started calling the entire complex Wentworth Hall and Cottages. Osgood's 1884 guide states, "This hotel has running water, good drainage, telephone, telegraph," things that are very important for staying in a hotel, I guess, electric bells, steam heat, livery stable, tennis court, croquet lawn, dance room, open fireplaces in all public rooms, 650 feet of piazzas with a veranda, magnificent dining hall, tables supplied from Hotel Farm. Again, in 1889, one more cottage was added across the street called Wildwood Cottage. So here you can see, and this is what you see here. This is that porte cochere off the front of the Wentworth Hall now, the church, and then this is the Wildwood Cottage, which sits right on the bank of the river, where now the stone bridge is. But we'll get to that in a moment. It was probably in the 1890s that the original Thorn Mountain House was extensively remodeled on the outside. Gables and turrets were added to make it similar in style to the newer buildings. And then finally, Sunnyside Cottage was built in 1915 in the original location of the Glenthorne Cottage. So, let's walk through this a little bit, the evolution of Wentworth. So here you can see, and I love this photograph because so much history is here, which is now lost. So here you see the church at the end of Carter Notch, thank you. And you can see Wildwood is here, still on the bank of the river. And you can see the Wentworth Hall is here with the fireplace at the end. This is probably Alden, and then somewhere over here is Glenthorne, or actually at this point, no, Glenthorne. But you can see now that it has turrets on either end, but it also has a gable, which we didn't see in the earlier photographs. And then I always find this fascinating. So this is from a travel book, and you can see from the 1880s that we have Alden, Thornycroft, the Wentworth Hall in the back, and the Thorn Mountain House that has some of the features on the lower levels, but still has the farmhouse roof. And that the gables that we see today are not even there yet. So then even here in 1890, right, we can see there are a couple of things I like about this photograph. One is that you can see Thornycroft, you can see the Wentworth Hall, you can see the more Queen Anne-ified version of the Thorn Mountain House, or now Wentworth Hall, and then the church and Wildwood. Now what's interesting about this is that you can see that second gable isn't there yet, still. So that came much later. But the other thing that's really interesting about this is that this is as much about placemaking as it is about building. So what they've done is they've created a town center, a town green with the church at the end, a very typical New England configuration of buildings that create a space outside the buildings. A lot of that is lost now, but essentially the reason that was able to happen was because the way to get to this area was over the bridge that was back here. And that the abutments are still there in the river, right across, right here actually, right behind the Historical Society. And that bridge eventually was moved up to the falls, to Valley Cross Road. That's the same bridge that was down here. And this other bridge didn't exist yet. So basically when you came in and traveled through town, you came over that bridge and then into the square. And that square, basically you arrived in Jackson. What's interesting too, so going back to this, you can see that the one gable is there on that side, and then looking at it from the other side, and this is actually a view from the Gray's Inn, you can see that one of the two gables is now built, and this is in 1890. So that second gable must have come, I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but it must have come much later. But you see how much more building there was on the site. And then here, by 1892, you can see that second gable. And where that second floor balcony and porch was is now an oriel window under the extended eaves of this gable. So now this all sort of comes together with Alden, Thornycroft, Wentworth Hall in the background, the Queen Anne version, full Queen Anne version of the Wentworth Hotel, the porte cochere. They go under the church at the end of the square. You can see how much grass there is here and how green it is. And then Wildwood Cottage. So this is 1892. So here's a map from 1892, and you can see that it's a little distorted, but essentially where the two rivers come together, there's actually a road that comes up from the Honeymoon Bridge, right? And then this is where the post office is now. It was the Jackson Falls house. And then you came across that bridge to where we are now. You came across that bridge and then down into the square where the church was. So the church is really over here. And then the Wentworth, you can see Wentworth Hall here. And this is actually a piece of that map that the Society just sold an original version of. And so here we are in 1915. So you can see that we have all the Queen Anne embellishments of the Wentworth Hotel itself. You can see that Alden is here. And by now, this is Sunnyside. So Sunnyside was built in 1915, which replaced Glenthorne. So now we're going to take a step back into history again, outside of Jackson. And then the next evolution of architecture from the Greek Revival to the stick to the colonial to the Queen Anne is the shingle style. And so we saw each of those. We saw the Greek Revival at the church, we saw the Queen Anne at Wentworth, and now we're going to explore the shingle style as it applies here in Jackson. So the shingle style is a uniquely American architectural style. It was made popular by the New England School of Architecture, which eschewed the highly ornamented patterns of the Queen Anne style. It was influenced by a combination of the English Romantic style and colonial architecture of early America, with its plain shingled surfaces. So you can see that the gables are not as steep. In most cases, the shingles cover the entire building, and they're much more horizontal. The shingle style is characterized by a tautness of flat shingled surfaces, asymmetrical facades, and an emphasis on the horizontal. The shingle style introduced a picturesque, organic design with an emphasis on horizontal planes. The buildings embraced their site with a softer transition from the natural to the built environment. So you can see certainly here, you could imagine these houses growing up out of the rocky environment that they're in, and then sweeping up with these sweeps up to the sky. They appear to grow from their natural surroundings, emphasized with a stone foundation and the ubiquitous flared bird beams. So that would be these. And that takes us to William Ralph Emerson, a cousin of Ralph Waldo Emerson, as it turns out, who is also known as the father of the shingle style. And there's some controversy about that, or some from varied histories, we'll say. Although William Ralph Emerson was born in 1833 in Illinois, he spent his childhood and formative years in Kennebunk, Maine, and Boston. He was self-taught as an architect and started his career in 1857 before going off on his own in 1873. Like many architects of his time, William Ralph Emerson initially designed in the classic revival style, the stick style, and the Queen Anne style, which, as we now know, eventually evolved into the beginnings of the shingle style. Emerson's 1879 house Redwood in Bar Harbor, Maine, which is this one here, was considered the first design to be regarded as shingle style. In Roger Reed's book, A Delight to All Who Know It, puts it, the act that the exterior is fully shingled from roof to just above grade level. For this reason, the architect is credited for inventing the shingle style. So here you can see the shingle comes all the way right down to the top of the foundation. Comes all the way down. You can see on some of his other designs the same thing. The shingle basically covers the entire building. Now, I threw this poem in here. This is actually a poem that he wrote. And I thought it was really salient for the time, but also for the architecture. And so I'll read it. A nation's strength. What makes a nation's pillars high and its foundations strong? What makes it mighty to defy the foes that round it throng? It is not gold. Its kingdoms grand go down in battle shock. Its shafts are laid on sinking sand, not on abiding rock. Is it the sword? Ask the red dust of empires passed away. The blood has turned their stones to rust, their glory to decay. And is it pride? Ah, that bright crown has seemed to nations sweet, but God has struck its luster down in ashes at his feet. Not gold, but only men can make a people great and strong. Men who for truth and honor's sake stand fast and suffer long. Brave men who work while others sleep, who dare while others fly. They build a nation's pillars deep and lift them to the sky. And now back to Jackson. A free public library for the town of Jackson, New Hampshire. It started actually in June of 1827. The Adams Social Library Society was incorporated. It was most likely a small reading group because there's no record of a special building or supply of books. However, in August of 1879, there was a subscription paper for books opened at the Thorn Mountain House, and this is a copy of that letter. And it reads, a fund of $20.35 has been raised by contribution to be used as the nucleus for a free public library for the town of Jackson, New Hampshire. The subscribers hereto in aid of this enterprise hereby agree to contribute from our private collections the number of volumes set opposite to our names, and to forward the same at our convenience by express or otherwise to M.C. Wentworth, in whose care they are to be entrusted until the organization of the library shall be completed. A library open to the public and free to all will naturally produce among the people a desire to read, and it seems therefore desirable that in the beginning a taste should be created and fostered for substantial and careful information to be found in history, travel, biography, physiology, entertaining stories by popular authors, not to the exclusion of what is termed yellow-covered literature, and other light reading, which may not be so objectionable, yet quite as useful. A free use of the library will be forever reserved to all residents and all visitors within the limits of the town. 1879. August 16th, 1879. Before a town meeting, and this is from the history of Jackson, before a town meeting, the artist Frank Shapley had organized a fundraising campaign with the purpose of building a library to house the books which had been donated by General Wentworth and his guests in 1880 and later. Shapley enlisted the Boston architect William Ralph Emerson, who had designed his home, to design a suitable building. The foundation was begun in October 1900 on land on the west bank of the Wildcat River between land owned by the Protestant Chapel Association and land owned by Georgia A. Wentworth of Wentworth Hall. The building opened to the public on the 1st of August in in 1901. So this is an actual, the original rendering from William Ralph Emerson that's actually at the library. And what's fascinating about this that really sort of captures, now this is around 1900, so it's a little bit later in the shingle style era, but you can see it certainly captures the essence of the shingle style. It's the rocky bank of the river rises up and becomes the foundation for the building. The building swoops up from the foundation and creates these low, wide gambrel roofs that are asymmetrical, horizontal, over extended eaves, the curved verge boards at the eaves, and then a nice little gentle entrance and a chimney in the middle. So it's a single-story wood shingle design with an asymmetrical gambrel roof and a porch. It's set on a foundation of dressed granite blocks with corbels at the front corners. And I'll show you a photograph of that in a minute. Projecting from the larger gambrel is a smaller offset gambrel covering the entrance. The overhang of the smaller front gambrel is supported by two sweeping shingled brackets and sweeping shingled end walls. So these are the two sweeping brackets that support the gambrel roof, and then the two sweeping end walls that support it as well. A very organic architecture. And again, we see that the shingle, in this case, when it was originally built, probably had shingle roof, wood shingle roofs, that then at the rate, which is this line here, was all shingle, and all the surfaces are shingle. Everything is shingle, all the way down to the foundation. And that's what makes it shingle style. So let's take a look at it in some context here. So this was from 1901, plus or minus, but you can see its relationship to the church, and it's sitting on the bank of the river. The barn behind the church is still there. Looks like there's a fence there to keep you from falling into the river. And what's interesting is even now, many years later, right, even the configuration of the shutters and the composition of all this really hasn't changed much at all. Here's another photograph of it. And you can see the barn's open and there's a carriage there. You can see there's some seating on the front porch of the library. And it's very overgrown at this point too. And here's another photograph with the library, and adjacent to it, this is the Wildwood Cottage, which also sits on the bank of the river. And so here's another view looking at it. Now, again, what's interesting here is we can see there's plenty of, again, there's some placemaking going on here, right? So the relationship of the library to the church creates this little green where presumably one could come out either from the library or from the church after a service and sort of hang out. Part of that town green. So I found this photograph fascinating. So what you'll see is that the simplicity of this deck remains, and that if there are simply, in this case, two granite steps that take you up to that sort of come out of the earth, right? And then you can see the sweeping walls on the ends, the sweeping verge boards, but its relationship also to the wildwood. And the wildwood, even though it has shingles, has some other details. So it's probably transitional between the Queen Anne and the shingle style. And here a full view. And again, you can see the shingles even on the rakes of the gables, the sweeping verge boards, the overhangs, and the sweeping brackets that are all shingle, all covered in shingle down to the stone foundation. And so some of the elements of a good shingle style is the asymmetry, the wood shingles, a gambrel roof, a wide gambrel roof, the front porch entry, a horizontal form, and then not only the sweeping verge boards, but shingle sweeps at the bottom as well that come out over the stone foundation. Now I had the fortune as well, when I found that rendering that you saw in the beginning of this section here from William Ralph Emerson, to get access to a couple drawings, original drawings from William Ralph Emerson. Now, it's hard to tell because there's not a full set of drawings for this, and that presumably, late in his career, he might have been asked to do this on a napkin. Right? We still do that today. Sometimes little follies or little projects like this, you might just do on a napkin, work with a builder, and then add some details later. And so these are some of the details that were drawn, and these drawings are probably about 36 inches by 24 inches. They're pretty big. And so he laid out the details for each of these elements, right? So you'll see here the shingle, and it sweeps out over the crown, and then there's a beadboard back here. And that's this detail right here. So you can see how the shingle sweeps out, sits on this crown, and then goes back. And presumably there's a beadboard back there. And then similar detail here in the corner. You can also see the detail of this piece here, this arch that's coming here, and the detail and how each one of those was thought of. And so here we're just zooming in on that. You can see the detail there that's articulated in this drawing. And then here you can even see the entrance over the door, which we'll see right here. So you can see he's designed all of this and detailed all of it almost to full scale. And then these are the top of the pilasters that support that crown at that arch. And then here you can really see the sweeping of the walls, the end walls, the brackets, all covered in shingle. So this is a photograph that I took from down below, and you really sort of get that sense of it rising up and emerging from the earth. On the left, so this is one of the sweeping walls on the ends, and then a detail of the sweep and how you can see how fussy they get with the shingles to get that effect. That it's not only sweeping in one direction, but actually in 3 different directions. And so, here we are. We have now Sunnyside by 1915, Alden in 1881, Thornycroft 1885, Wentworth Hall, and the Thorn Mountain House, now the Wentworth Hall. We have the church, the library, and Wildwood. And this was in 1931, so this is what it looked like. And you can see even then, the road came up, crossed the bridge, and then basically created this village square in a way here. Well, in 1931, at the March Town Meeting, it was voted to build a new bridge across the Wildcat River near the library and move the old bridge to the Valley Cross Road. So this bridge now is up at Valley Cross. In October, the library was moved closer to the church and rotated to face north. The stone bridge was built the following summer. So not only did the library move, but Wildwood moved as well to their current locations. So Wildwood is now up here at this end of the Wentworth Hall complex cottages, and the library is now down here. Now, one of the things that was interesting about reading about the library too is it originally had a bay window on the back so that you could look out over the river. Now, of course, you can look out on the parking lot. So I've taken you on a journey of 3 buildings in Jackson Village, along the way with a bit of cultural history and an introduction to architectural history of the time. As hopefully you can see, America was emerging as an independent nation and looking for its own identity. The architecture of its place was doing the same, going from looking to classical forms and references to developing a style uniquely its own. A style that grows from its surroundings and evokes the vastness and organic nature of this nation, from wooded lands to villages and to the open prairies. So I want to conclude with one of Vincent Scully's most famous and most resonant definitions of architecture. One that speaks not only to individual buildings, but also to the relationship of buildings to each other. Buildings in relation to its environment as well as its surroundings. Buildings designed and built by people, reflected in their own time and culture. And I quote, "A continuing dialogue between the generations which creates an environment developing across time is architecture." Thank you.
Things that I never noticed. I played cards in the old library, and there's just so much detail there. And I apologize for it being cold. We lost our furnace in a rainstorm a week or so ago. So we're looking into long-term ideas of what to do with this building. And Chris mentioned Alice Pepper's book several times, which is a fabulous book, and it's been unavailable for quite a few years. We're looking into reprinting it, so stay tuned. There's lots of things that is going to be happening with the society. Are there any quick questions? No? Well, listen, thank you so much, Chris.